And it also immediately kind of guides us to our next talk, our next case study that will be delivered by Sohini, who is the Deputy CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. So Sohini gonna provide really the patient perspective in today's discussion, and in particular here the outlook. Leveraging partnerships to support digital biomarker development is the title of her talk. Sohini, please go ahead.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's event. I very much appreciate the opportunity to hear all this great information, as well as to be able to share a little bit of our experience here at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So just a little bit of background on the Michael J. Fox Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a relatively young organization that started actually 20 years ago. This is our 20th year. And we were founded with one mission in mind, which is really to aggressively fund research to be able to develop therapies that will have a significant impact for patients. And in the best possible case, hopefully it would be a cure for the disease itself or prevent the disease from ever developing. So one of the things that is really critical in our mind as we think about how to allocate the resources we have is to ensure that what we're doing and what we're promoting really is going to have that impact for patients, that it is going to address unmet needs, it is going to have a significant impact on quality life, etc. And as a foundation, while we're a very successful foundation, we're the largest private funder of Parkinson's research, having funded about over 100 million last year alone, we still recognize that our resources when it comes to drug development are just a drop in the pool. So this concept of partnerships is really critical when we think about how we can get literally the biggest bang for our buck. It's about really figuring out how we can amplify what we can do by working with partners in other areas who have the expertise, the resources, et cetera, to drive the field forward. And certainly the concept of digital biomarkers is extremely interesting for us. I won't belabor this. I think a lot of the speakers in earlier sessions today talked about why digital biomarkers or how digital data collection could really improve the way we think about therapeutic development. And actually, it related to a question that was just posed in the presentation before, could probably also significantly impact the way patients are actually treated by their physicians. So I'm not going to belabor this other than there's a great opportunity, and in Parkinson's research, we too have embraced this opportunity, and there's a lot of activity that's ongoing. In fact, there's, and I've mentioned this in last year's event, there's a fantastic, and Kirsten also mentioned this, there's this fantastic collaboration between Roche, for example, and the Fox Foundation in trying to develop ways to really digitally capture aspects of the disease and quantify it and understand its impact on patients. But what I want to shift a little bit my discussion on today is last year when I spoke at this event, I talked quite a bit about the way we work with groups to collect the data from the patients. And this year, what I would like to talk a little bit about is going a step further, because when you think about things from a patient perspective, as someone who has a disease, a lot is going on. And when you're thinking about what you're trying to do to develop that drug, that therapeutic that is going to have an impact on a patient, it's not just understanding what matters to the patient. It's also understanding what's going on biologically. What is the clinician seeing that might be a trigger for him or her as he or she is thinking about what's going on with the disease and how it's being presented. And so what I'd like to talk about today is if you look at this schematic, last year I sort of talked about the digital data collection and acquisition, and you sort of see this part here. What I'd like to talk about today is the concept of partnerships and the way partnerships can really accelerate what we do with the data and really transforming data into information. Because I think that one of the things that we have struggled with in the Parkinson's disease arena, and I don't think it's solely, it's just solely our field, this applies to other fields, is that it's not so easy to take the data and really look at it, mold it, and understand how to use it, apply it, and what insights you should take from it that actually matter. And so what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is data sharing and the analytics, because these are areas where you really do need partners to be able to really accelerate the understanding and the relevance of the digital data and digital biomarker data that one is collecting. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the Parkinson's field, there are an enormous amount of data sets that have been collected on Parkinson's disease patients and control participants. And they span a wide variety of modalities in terms of the type of data being captured. And this is just a sort of a snapshot of some of the things that we're working on. And it's absolutely not, comprehensive. There are additional data sets that exist out there. But these are things that the foundation is actively working on. So to give you a little bit of sense, the ones that are highlighted in orange are studies that the foundation has actually had really no role in, meaning that we were not the sponsor, we were not necessarily a funder, et cetera, or we had a very sort of hands-off approach if we were funding. So these are not things that fall in our domain in terms of being able to access the data easily, et cetera. And then you can sort of see on the other end of the slide the type of data that are being collected. And again, these are very kind of broad-based categories. Within them, clinical. This includes clinical data reported not just by a clinician, but also directly reported by a patient. In imaging, this could involve both sort of scans as well as analyses. It could involve different types of imaging scans, from sort of MRI to, for example, in Parkinson's, DAT scan is quite a common ligand that's used. So this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of everything that's going on. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because I think that sometimes when we talk about the promise of digital data collection or digital biomarkers, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that in and of itself, this data doesn't yield its full promise. The full promise of it really is when you can begin to correlate it, or you can begin to draw a narrative or the connections with what is being collected through those platforms with what else is going on as imaged in the brain, for example, in Parkinson's, as what is being reported by the patient or by the clinician or both, as what is being shared when you're looking at genetics or omics data, etc. And this is something where I think the field as a whole is in its early days. And in Parkinson's, and again, I would say that this is not solely relegated to our field. I think this encompasses many diseases. It's really hard. We are used to, for imaging experts to look at the imaging data, maybe work with some clinicians and do some analyses. We are used, the genetics world, they run with it when they look at their large data sets, et cetera. But it's extremely difficult to be able to look at all of these modalities and figure out how do you combine them? How do you make these analyses sort of integrated, as opposed to siloed based on the kind of what they're looking at? And then how do you correlate what you're seeing with what the patient is reporting and what your digital device is collecting? And I think the reason why I wanted to highlight this here this year when it comes to partnerships is that I think this is an area where the idea of going it alone or doing one or two groups is going to fail. I think this requires a lot of expertise from a lot of areas and fields, both within the healthcare sector and certainly outside the healthcare sector, within experts in certain modalities, as well as those that may not really know much about disease, but are good with just analytics or have novel platforms, etc. So this is something I wanted to raise because I think often we tend, when we think about digital data again, to sort of look at it in a particular bubble. And again, and we at the foundation, when we think about the patient and what it takes to get a drug that really impacts the patient biologically, from its symptom perspective, from the quality of life perspective, et cetera, we recognize that the digital is just one component and the rest has to feed into it. And I know I'm not saying anything unique, but I think in the excitement of digital biomarkers, we sometimes forget the focus on the fact that all of these other things have got to mesh with the digital data that are being collected. So again, this gives you a little bit of a sense here of some of the things that we at the foundation have tried to do. And what you'll see here is we've worked. This is just a snapshot again, a small parcel of the collaborations that we have tried to establish to be able to get at this really hard problem of figuring out how do you look at these data in a comprehensive, integrated fashion, recognizing that there's practicalities involved. Some of these data sets are enormous, and how do you manage them? And then how do you get the data to speak to each other when they can be so different? And how do you actually pool the right expertise? How do you get the person who has the knowledge of the disease to be able to work with the individuals who are good at manipulating the data, et cetera, and getting them to speak to each other, if I were to say it in very simplistic terms. And so what you can see here is we've tried a lot of different approaches, from actually working with groups that have very unique platforms, to kind of creating data challenges where we're just throwing it out there and trying to get people immersed in it and get novel insights, to having very targeted funding programs where we're saying, here are these data. We want you to just try to address this question to get a starting off point. And obviously, in hindsight, I probably missed one thing that I should have highlighted on this slide, but sort of the umbrella or the rainbow or the bubble that sort of circles everything again is this concept of, are the insights or are the analyses that are coming out, are they things that matter to the patients? So it could be extremely interesting, for example, to say XYZ goes up and it correlates to this, that, and the other. But if it actually doesn't matter from a patient perspective, and the patient says, you know what, I can easily live with that, is that something that we should look at? And I think it's really important, especially in these early days as we're collecting a lot of things, to integrate that perspective. And I think the speakers in the previous session, as well as some of the earlier sessions, did a beautiful job illuminating the fact that it's really important to get that perspective, because it's as valuable to be able to take things off the table as it is to understand what should remain on the table and what has impacted, what we should focus on, ensuring we really understand. And so again, this just gives a little bit of a sense of how we think about partnerships. The idea that we have to go both within the field, we have to go outside the field, and increasingly we have to get really diverse groups who have not played together in the sandbox to work together, and to value the fact that whatever they may find may at the end of the day not matter to a patient, and we have to continue to go further, or it may matter to the patient, in which case that's fantastic. Shot on goal, we scored, let's keep moving. So I was also asked to talk a little bit about the lessons from partnerships. And I talked about this a little bit last year, but I think again, as a group like ours, where we really are in many respects hamstrung because we have limited resources, we are trying to do a lot of things because we're trying to tackle both, addressing the immediate needs of a patient today, how we can improve the quality of life of a patient today and tomorrow, as well as the long-term goals of potentially creating disease-modifying therapies, or even being able to prevent the onset of the disease. Because we're trying to do a lot of these, we are by our very nature constrained with how we can put our resources. We have to take a portfolio approach. We have to have a lot of different goals and a lot of different shots on goals. So partnerships are really, really critical for us to be able to move things forward. And so while we're by no means the expert on partnerships, I do think there's a lot that we've learned, particularly as we think now about not just developing the way to capture the way to capture digital data from patients, but what you actually do with it. How do you again translate the data into information, and from that information, how do you translate that information into insights that matter for patients? And there are some things here, and again, none of it is rocket science, but I think it's important to outline, because I do really feel that this digital biomarkers, again, we all believe in its promise, but it's complex, and we're not really fully realizing its potential yet, at least in the Parkinson's field. We're making progress, but there's still a lot to do, and partnerships are key to being able to keep that momentum going. So when you think about some of the partnerships, I think complementary goals and objectives really matter. And the reason I highlight this is because what matters to patients what matters for a for-profit entity, what matters for a nonprofit entity, what matters for a government. All of these are going to be very different, and that's absolutely fine, so long as there is a complementary component to these differing goals or objectives. We are not at the foundation naive enough to think that anyone is doing drug development out of pure altruism. Obviously, helping people matters, otherwise one wouldn't get into this business, but certainly there's a business component to it, and profit has to be factored in, etc. So it doesn't need to be exactly the same, but the goals and the objectives do need to be complementary. Clarity of responsibility and ownership of work streams and deliverables. I think this really matters as well. You know, when you have a lot of expertise, when you're looking at a lot of different types of data, you're going to have a lot of experts in the room. And yet they're experts in their particular domain, not necessarily in the whole puzzle, just in their particular puzzle piece. So being really clear about what the ownership is and where and how to facilitate the communication and the interaction is, I think, extremely important if you're going to make progress. Prioritization within respective groups. Does this really matter? Are they actually devoting the resources to it? Are they meeting deliverables and timelines and things like this? Again, it kind of spans the gamut for partnerships in general. But I think that when you look at data and you are trying to build new models and create new algorithms, looking at very diverse streams of data, you're dependent upon each other. And so when you are not able to meet your respective goals, the whole sort of pyramid in many respects falls down. And a true belief in partnership, we're all in this together. I think that there's going to obviously be a lot of roadblocks, a lot of frustration, a lot of 5 steps forward, 4 steps back sort of things as one begins to tackle these very complex, challenging topics. But one thing that sort of sustains momentum is really believing that there's a team effort and a team objective and that everybody is part of that. Red flags where things might not be ending well, I think, is this perception that not all parties are equal. And I think that, again, when you sort of, especially from a nonprofit kind of component, I think there is sometimes a little bit of a sense of not what every group brings to the table is not equal. And I think particularly when we talk about patient input or patient perspective, you know, I'll be maybe a little provocative here. I think this concept of patient centricity or patient-centered research has become very much a buzzword over the past several years. I think truly believing that the patient perspective is as equal as other perspectives, I don't think everybody really believes that. And I think you can feel that and hear that in certain partnerships. And I think that if you don't have that perception at the end of the day, that the needs and the insights and the impact on patients is as valuable as everything else, then probably things won't go as far as they could. Groups doing the work not having decision-making input or ownership of resources. I think that we and many here may also have had this experience where you're working with a team and it's fantastic, but that team may not be the engineers in the room, you know, not the basement per se or the garage, but in the room in the back who are doing a lot of the work. And it turns out the engineers have their own priorities. So, and what you may have devised in your Gantt chart or your work plan would have been great, but the engineers then tell you, nope, can't do that on that time frame. So I think when you have that disconnect and the people who are actually doing a lot of the real hardcore sort of work are not part of the process, or the people who are leading the process don't have that input and that buy-in, things will fall apart. And finally, support from all levels of an organization. I think that this is also very critical. Again, you know, putting sort of the very practical business hat on, totally recognize that, you know, we and the foundation, we have a very unique perspective. At the end of the day, our mandate is to help Parkinson's patients. We recognize that for other groups, that may be a mandate now, but in 2 years, that may not be in the top 3 priorities of an organization. That may be priority number 7. And that may mean a shifting of things. We recognize that, and that is okay. But we still want to make sure that things can continue. And in order to be able to make sure that even if resources change, there can still be an ongoing commitment, that requires support from all levels of the organization, so that even if things shift, there's still activity that can be done, and projects that are honestly more long-term in nature can still move forward. So again, this isn't fully comprehensive, but these are some of the things that I wanted to highlight as things that we've learned in terms of partnerships. So with that, I will end, and I just want to thank again the organizers for the invitation to participate today.
Well, thank you, Sohini, for this very comprehensive discussion of the patient and also the collaboration perspective. We have one question so far that is essentially around, or it's maybe more an offer than a question. And maybe it's due to the digital overwhelming, how should I say, density of the discussion we are facing here, that the pipeline of questions is running leaner at the moment. So the proposal here is, you are talking about the umbrella, right, that we need to consider. And the question here is, isn't that just the individual patient context? Isn't it the contextualization that you are referring to here?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand the comment, and I'm not 100% sure I do, and it may have been the way that I phrased it, is that there are perspectives that you can do in aggregating patient input and insights, but especially in a disease like Parkinson's, and again, it's not solely relevant to Parkinson's, it holds true for many diseases. When a disease is as heterogeneous as Parkinson's, what matters will also take an individual context. And I think it's the balance in the research objectives of what is going to have the biggest impact for as many people as possible versus what is also going to have an impact for that particular individual's journey with the disease. And I think there is a balance there of how you go about it, and recognizing that there probably are multiple perspectives that have to be integrated to be able to address both the aggregate patient community, as well as ensuring that what is being sort of filtered through also has relevance for individual patient journeys. So I don't know if that's exactly what the comment was trying to get at, but that is correct. You have to have a balance between the two.
So thank you so much, Sohini. Great presentation as always. Pleasure having you here.